that comes on there. What's he laughing about? All right. Good morning, everybody. The thousands in attendance and the millions watching around the world. So last Sunday, Brad had Deuteronomy and did extremely well with it. And I was worried about having to follow that because that's not necessarily my strongest book of the Bible. But when I opened it up, I have 2 Samuel, which is probably one of my favorites. So that's a God thing. So I'll open the text today comes from 2 Samuel chapter 9, verses 1 through 7, and then chapter 9, verse 12. David asked, "Is there anyone still left of the house of Saul to whom I can show kindness for Jonathan's sake?" Now there was a servant of Saul's household named Ziba. They summoned him to appear before David, and the king said to him, "Are you Ziba?" "At your service," he replied. The king asked, "Is there no one still alive from the house of Saul to whom I can show God's kindness?" And Ziba answered the king, "There is still a son of Jonathan. He is lame in both feet." "Where is he?" the king asked. Ziba answered, "He is at the house of Machir, son of Amiel, in Lo-debar." So King David had him brought from Lo-debar, from the house of Machir, son of Amiel. When Mephibosheth, son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, came to David, he bowed down to pay him honor. David said, "Mephibosheth, at your service," he replied. "Don't be afraid," David said to him, "for I will surely show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan. I will restore to you all the land that belonged to your grandfather Saul, and you will always eat at my table." Then the king summoned Ziba, Saul's steward, and said to him, "I have given your master's grandson everything that belonged to Saul and his family. You and your sons and your servants are to farm the land for him and bring in the crops, so that your master's grandson may be provided for. And Mephibosheth, grandson of your master, will always eat at my table." And it mentions here Ziba had 15 sons and 20 servants. Then Ziba said to the king, "Your servant will do whatever my lord the king commands his servant to do." So Mephibosheth ate at David's table like one of the king's sons. Mephibosheth had a young son named Micah, and all the members of Ziba's household were servants of Mephibosheth. So the lesson context for this one is really important because we're at the point now where David has wiped out all his enemies and he's completely taken command. And it talks about, in the lesson context, it says, clues from the surrounding material place today's text some 15 to 20 years after David began his reign in 1010 BC. David had spent much of his time solidifying his control as king over all Israel by defeating enemies both within and without. Saul and Jonathan at this time had been dead for some time. Another of Saul's sons, Ishbosheth, ruled in the northern tribes until his own death, at which time David began his rule over all Israel. But the tribes had shown their preference for a descendant of Saul on the throne. In situations such as this one, it was often top priority for a king from a new ruling family to kill off all members of the previous king's household, thereby eliminating any rivals. So that's key as we move into the text. In verse 1, it was David asked, "Is there anyone still left of the house of Saul?" And it talks about how, David had vowed against destroying Saul's house, both to Saul and to Jonathan in 1 Samuel. And so in spite of the potential threats to his rule, David determined to keep his promises and spare the lineage of his friend and former king. It says, how could David not know whether anyone of Saul's household still lived? And for one thing, he had been busy with wars, establishing Jerusalem as his capital and trying to move the ark. So with everything going on in that period, there's no way that he kept track of what descendants were still around. It says, but the answer may be even simpler than that. Saul's family was hiding. So, if you know the story with Saul and David, it didn't end amicably. So that kind of furthered the mystery of who all was still under his household. And it said, knowing that David had been crowned king first in Judah and then over all Israel, any remaining sons of Saul would have to fear that they would be executed to prevent their trying to regain the throne. And 1b, to whom I can show kindness for Jonathan's sake. Now it talks about here you can kind of question David's motives a little bit. It could either be that, he's trying to lure the remaining members of the household out so that he can kind of finish the job and consolidate power. And it could be a situation politically where, they mentioned in lesson context that the northern tribes still preferred a direct descendant of Saul, that he's trying to score political points, to kind of bring that northern tribe into favor. It said, knowing that people rarely have pure motivations, it's possible that David valued both keeping potential usurpers close and scoring points with Saul's supporters, but his main motivation was neither of these things. David's pledge to Jonathan went so far as to ensure continual kindness to the same, even after, and this is the quote direct, the Lord has cut off every one of David's enemies from the face of the earth. So, David has the power now. He can do with it what he will. And it said, 2 Samuel details David's military defeat of all Israel's surrounding enemies. It is fitting that after we hear of David's enemies being cut off from the face of the earth, which we referenced a minute ago, we hear for his determination to find someone to care for Jonathan's sake. This kind of kindness often describes acts of loyalty or trustworthiness, which within the context of a promise. And it talks about how, sometimes you see the Hebrew word translated to love, which is direct of God's actions. And they talk about covenants were struck in situations where a power imbalance existed. So at the time that David and Jonathan made this covenant, Jonathan was heir to Saul's. Jonathan was next up. He had all the cards at that point. He was heir to Saul's throne. David was a soldier. He was a popular soldier, but he didn't have any claim to the throne at that time. And it says, by the time David was looking for an opportunity to act on this covenant, Jonathan was dead, and David himself was king instead. So, like I said, David had besides political points or anything like that, there was no reason for him to do something like this. It says, David's adherence to the covenant years later depended solely on his faithfulness toward Jonathan, not to any possible falling out of their friendship. And then in verse 2, now there was a servant of Saul's household named Ziba. They summoned him to appear before David, and the king said to him, "Are you Ziba?" "At your service," he replied. And it goes into this, Ziba, while he's listed as a servant at the time in historical biblical context, after their master had passed on, usually they inherited the estate. So while he was a servant, Saul's estate, he's sitting on a massive wealth. And it goes further into that here. It says, Ziba held high position among the servants in Saul's household, even after his death. He was the manager of Saul's estate at this point and had become wealthy as a result. So he would also be sure to know, for David to call him and ask what descendants remain, he would be one that would know the answer to that. He knows, the estate, he knows better than anybody. Excuse me. So it says, referring to himself as being at David's service, identified Ziba as being loyal to David. This was important to establish if Ziba worried that David might take revenge on the house of Saul, despite the king's claim to want to be kind to someone in the family. However, David had shown time and time again that he did not desire to wipe out Saul's family or his soldiers. And then in verse 3, the king asked, "Is there no one still alive from the house of Saul to whom I can show God's kindness?" So he restates his question here. He asked at the beginning, "Is there no one here from the house of Saul that he can show favor?" And then he restates it here to where he words it, "To whom I can show God's kindness." And so, although the question would not be redundant to Ziba, who was hearing it for the first time, the repetition emphasizes for the reader David's urgent desire. So this is something that's really important to him. This is top priority. The slight difference of showing God's kindness rather for Jonathan's sake, which is the way he worded it the first time, recalls God's favor expressed through and as a result of his covenant with Israel. And again, they talk about the translation and the covenant of love. Verse 3, Ziba answered the king, "There is still a son of Jonathan, and he is lame in both feet." Now they talk about how this son is referenced At the time he's referenced earlier in biblical text, he was 5 years old, and this was when Saul and Jonathan died in battle. And at that time, his nurse fled with the boy, likely thinking that David would come to eliminate him. Unfortunately, though, the boy fell during the flight and suffered permanently crippling injuries. As Ziba spoke, the child would probably be in his early to mid-20s. Ziba did not mention the child's name in his reply to David, but seems quick to have mentioned his disability, which maybe indicated that he would figure that David would know which son he was talking about. And it said also, perhaps he sought to reassure David that Jonathan's son was no threat, so that David would not seek to kill him. Or perhaps he hoped David would do exactly that, relieving Ziba of any obligation to provide for him. And Ziba comes up later as far as, trying to kind of get back the power and the wealth that he has at this point. Where is he, the king asked. And Ziba answered, he's at the house of Machir, son of Ammiel, in Lodabar. And it says Lodabar was a village east of the Jordan River. It was located much closer to Ishbosheth's political center, Menahem, than to David's capital, Jerusalem. Although Machir had probably been a supporter of Saul originally, we later learned that he supported David and his men during Absalom's revolt. The outcome of David's inquiry here may have changed the man's loyalties. And then it moves on into verses 5 and 6. It said, so King David had him brought from Lodabar, from the house of Machir, son of Ammiel. When Mephibosheth, son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, came to David, he bowed down to pay him honor. Mephibosheth immediately honored David and addressed him with the deferential language appropriate when speaking to a king, which is what Ziba did earlier. As a potential rival to the throne, being son of Jonathan, who was the firstborn son of the dead King Saul, Mephibosheth must have felt the tension in this moment. So you go back and you put yourself in this guy's shoes. Okay, David has consolidated power. He's wiped out every enemy that he's got. And the first thing you hear is somebody saying, hey, David wants to speak to you at the Capitol. So, I mean, I don't know how I would take that, but, I'm paranoid by nature. I probably would find a way out. But he goes. And in verse 7, don't be afraid, David said to him, for I will surely show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan. I will restore to you all the land that belonged to your grandfather Saul, and you will always eat at my table. So if there were any tension, the first thing David said is, hey, you're good. I'm going to give you back everything that we took, everything that belongs to you rightfully. So tension cut. Given the practice of familial annihilation discussed above, Mephibosheth may have expected to receive anything but kindness from David. But David immediately, it's not like they talked for an hour and then he wheedles this in. This was the way he opened the conversation. David immediately offered reassurance to Mephibosheth that he need not be afraid. David's summon was not, as it turns out, a ruse to flush Mephibosheth out of hiding. Instead, David wanted to show him kindness for the sake of his father in order to keep his covenant with Jonathan. Mephibosheth would eat at the king's table just as David had once eaten at Saul's table. David's desire to restore to Mephibosheth the estate of his father suggests that David had gathered additional information beyond what is stated in these verses. Mephibosheth, living in Lodabar in Machir's house, makes clear that he wasn't living on any of Saul's lands, whether or not he was seeking any other benefit from the properties. Having the land restored cemented that Mephibosheth would receive whatever wealth was to be made from his grandfather's holdings. Mephibosheth seems sincerely and humbly grateful for David's kindness to him. Mephibosheth no doubt knew of his father's friendship with David and had probably heard stories of Jonathan's aid to David. But you look at, I know we had a lesson not too long ago that talked about if you're crippled in biblical times, it's not like today, which is still a hindrance today, obviously. But at that time, that was it. You were at the mercy of everybody around you and whatever estate you were a part of. But for him to restore his land so he gets wealth off all his father's real estate holdings, which is, for his situation to be lame, that takes care of not him, but the generations after him too. Verse 9, then the king summoned Ziba, Saul's steward, and said to him, I have given your master's grandson everything that belonged to Saul and his family. David had come to possess Saul's land, whether because of marriage or as forfeiture to his throne after the failure of Ishbosheth's brief reign. By returning Saul's property to Jonathan's son, David executed not only kindness but also restorative justice. Perhaps Ziba had taken advantage of Mephibosheth's disabled condition and commandeered Saul's estate for himself. His motives are not analyzed here, but later events suggest that would be in character for the steward. Verse 10, you and your sons and your servants are to farm the land for him and bring in the crop so that your master's grandson may be provided for. And Mephibosheth, grandson of your master, will also always eat at my table. And it says, although Mephibosheth would eat in David's house, the land would provide for the rest of his family and for the servants supported through their own work. So even though Ziba's losing, whatever power he had commandeered at that time, this still provides kind of a win for him because, that's the wealth that comes from the land holdings is going to support the servants as well. So he's losing a lot of power, but he's still got a high stature for somebody in his position. And it talks about, again, how we referenced earlier that Ziba had 15 sons and 20 servants. And it talks again, Ziba had apparently grown wealthy as a result of his control over Saul's estate, having 20 servants of his own as well as 15 sons. His work on the land would continue to support his own household as well as Mephibosheth's. Excuse me. It says, verse 11, then Ziba said to the king, your servant will do whatever my lord the king commands his servant to do. So once again, Ziba emphasized loyalty to David, calling himself his servant twice. Though he did not protest David's decree, he nonetheless looked for an opportunity to have it annulled. His chance came years later when David fled the palace during Absalom's rebellion. So, he's okay with it now, but that doesn't mean that the first opportunity he has, he's not going to try to get back what he feels he lost. So Mephibosheth ate at David's table like one of the king's sons. It says, whereas Jonathan had loved David as himself, now David would care for Jonathan's son as his own. David's care for Mephibosheth yields a more satisfying conclusion to the story of David and Jonathan, which otherwise would have had a disheartening end. Now, I've been on a Harry Potter kick since we came back from Universal, so I saw some serious black Harry parallels here, and I told Jamie about them this morning over my coffee, and she wasn't too impressed with it. But I saw them, so, and I'm teaching, so. Let's see, joke's on me now, I lost my place. Okay, verse 12. Mephibosheth had a young son named Micah, and all the members of Ziba's household were servants of Mephibosheth. So Jonathan's grandson Micah would carry on the family, though one might expect David's sons to have some feelings about Mephibosheth's new role in their family. No hostilities between them are noted here or elsewhere. So, this is quite a day for this guy. You're lame, you see that the enemy of your grandfather has consolidated all power, and the first thing you're summoned to his palace, and you're told, hey, I'm giving you back everything. And not only that, you'll be treated as one of my own. So it's quite a day. But in the conclusion, it says, a kindness from experience. And the writer says, when I was a poor college student, times were tight financially, and I received many kindness from God's people who helped me through. Small gifts paid for meals, books, and gas, and always seemed to come when I needed them most. Now that I'm older, employed full-time, and the tables have turned, I try to remember those days and give some help to poor college students when the opportunity arises. For David, the idea that he would help others based on his own remembrances and experiences is a running theme throughout today's text. He showed kindness and justice to Mephibosheth, partly because David had pledged to do so, but also because he had received the same from Jonathan. And David remembered the ordeals he suffered at the hands of an unpredictable Saul and sought to rectify the misdeeds of that predecessor. So, everything that he went through with Saul, you wouldn't fault him. Us as humans were flawed. You wouldn't fault him for a revenge motive, but that's obviously not how he looked at it. But most of all, as a man after God's own heart, David sought to display in his kingship the characteristics of divine justice that were required of Israel as a whole. He knew that he must fear, serve, and love God with all his heart and soul. The same is true today. We are called to remember the kindness that God has shown us, especially through Jesus' life, death, and resurrection, and show that kindness to others. This may mean providing for the needs of others in our community. It could mean making restitution for wrongs that we did not commit. Justice and kindness call us to go beyond loving our friends to loving even those who may be enemies. In this way, we demonstrate the covenant kindness of our God. So I think the lasting impact to me was that when you look at where David was at in this text, he held all the cards, yet still chose to go this route. And I think that's what's hard for us, especially when you feel you've been wronged, and then you're in that position of power. What do you do after that? Do you turn around and ask for the other cheek, or do you follow David's example here? And like I said, we're humans. I'm speaking to myself more than anything. You feel that revenge factor sometimes, and you think, man, I'm in the driver's seat. I'd love to take advantage of this, but it's harder to go this route. But in the end, benefits everybody. So that was my lesson. I'm sorry I couldn't do Deuteronomy, but maybe next time.